Hello, this is Unit 1, Lesson 9 of Math 1 or Algebra 1, where we are doing Introduction to Domain and Range. So just as a review, domain is all possible x values of a line on a graph, and the range is all possible y values on a line of a graph. So range should not be confused with the statistical range, which means the difference between the minimum and maximum. So those are different things. Please do not get confused with those. And just as a quick disclaimer, this is a relatively new topic, so it is okay if you do not understand it, but it is just going to get a little bit getting used to. So yes, just as a refresher, domain is all x values and range is all y values. So there's normally two ways to show domain and range. There's inequality notation and interval notation. You talk about interval notation in Math 3 or Algebra 2, whichever one that your area offers. So right now I'm going to talk about inequality notation. An inequality is a range of numbers, just like how a domain or range is a range of numbers. All possible x values of a line means that x can be any number between this number and that number. Same with range. So that's why domain and range is a range of numbers, just like an inequality. And that's why this works. So just keep that in mind. So I have a line here. And here's going to be the step-by-step way that I am going to show domain and range. First, I'm going to list my coordinate points. So we can see that I have one here, and one here. So let's go in order. We've got 1, 2, 3, negative 1, negative 3, negative 2. We have negative 1, 0. And we have 1, 2. These are our coordinate points. So with the way we identify domain, because domain is all of our x values, correct? So all x values that are represented by this line. We read our domain and we write our domain from the left to right. So we read by like this, and it's going to make a little bit more sense when I explain. Range is read from bottom to top, so we read range like this. So let's go ahead and just show you how we would write domain using this example I have here. And we write our inequality like this. We put our lowest value, and then we have a sign, our letter if it's domain or range. Domain is x, range is y. We have another sign, and then we have our highest value. And you might be wondering, why does this make sense? So I'm just going to use this example up here. We know that we're going to use domain. We know that our x values are negative 3, negative 1, and 1. And since it's a solid line, we know that this line touches all of the numbers between this point and that point. Here and here is what the graph consists of. So all of these x values in this area are affected by this graph. So that's why this would be the domain. This area right here is the domain. So our lowest number, since we read from left to right, our lowest number, what comes first, is this one over here, which is negative 3. And then we'll add our sign here. For this, it's just going to be that, and I'll explain that later. And we're doing domain, so we add x. And now we have our highest. So when we finish going along the graph, we end up over here, which is 1. So that's why we'll just add another 1 here. And why does this make sense? Well, let's see. This is a compound inequality, which means that essentially it's two inequalities with one matching term in each of them that we can combine them together. So essentially, this is saying negative 3 must be less than or equal to x, and x must be greater than or equal to 1. It's two different inequalities that you can combine to make this. So let's see. The graph has values that are greater than negative 3, but less than 1. That's what this is saying. So let's go ahead and do an example. So what's a number that is bigger than 3, but less than 1? 0. Is 0 on our graph? Yeah, it is. 0 is right over here. Let's try another number. How about negative 1? Negative 1 is greater than negative 3. X is less than negative 1. Where's negative 1 on our graph? It is actually a coordinate that we have. It's here. See? So that means that the line of the graph, this for domain, says that all the values in between negative 3 and 1 are found on this graph. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's try it with range. So we know our range is negative 2, 0, and 2. Those are our y values in our coordinates. Negative 2 is first, and 2 is last. So we would write this as negative 2 comes first, y, because we're talking about range now, and then 2. This is inequality notation of range. Hopefully that made sense. Think of it that these values here are like in between the graph. So this line is in between the numbers negative 2 and 2. This line is in between the numbers negative 3 and 1. Now, you might be wondering, why do we use this? Why are we using this? And that's up here. So the graphs may have either an open circle, like this over here, or a closed circle. And essentially, that means that open circle is going to have no equal to, so it's going to look like that. Closed circle is going to, or a solid line is going to be equal to, so it's going to look like that. It's going to have the line. And essentially, what this is saying is that just like an equation that looks like this, the solution doesn't include this last number over here. So the domain and the range will not include this number, but it goes to this number. So for example, our domain is -2. So the domain can't be -2. However, it can be -1.9 repeating. So how would we write that? Well, this is our domain. I already have it written here. Of course, we see that our first number, we're reading from left to right, and the first number we come across is -2. However, it is open circle, so we have to make sure that we keep in mind that we have to use a non-equal to sign. We continue going, and then we reach the end of a closed circle at 3. So that's why we have a 3 over here. Similarly for range, we read from bottom to top, and we hit -2 in an open circle, which means that we don't include -2 in our final solution, so we have to make sure we add this. We continue going up until we meet this point over here, which is at not 2, it is at 3. 3. It is at 3. That's why we have a line that somewhat is like this. Hopefully that made sense. And just remember that a solid line also has this. Open circle means no, and then anything else means yes, you have to add that line. So hopefully this all makes sense, and I have some practice here so I can do it with you. First, we have this graph. Let's see what we're working on. So we know that our domain, we read from left to right. So we'll start on the left, which is -1, -2, -3. We're at -3. Remember, we're looking at the x value of the coordinate, so we have -3 as our last, and it is a closed circle. Closed means equal to, and we're looking at the domain, so it's x. We continue reading from left to right, and then we hit our final x value up here. So we're like that. This x value is 1 to +3, and it is an open circle. Open circle means you just have to add that. So essentially saying, this equation is saying that any value in between -3 and 3 can be found on this graph. Each x value in between these two numbers has a respective y value. Now let's try range. The range starts from, we used to go bottom to top, and let's start down here. We hit a closed circle at -1, -2, -3. Again, so -3. And since it's closed circle, and y. We add a y because we're talking about the range. Now we continue reading up. We continue reading up where we get to over here, which is 1, 2. When we do that, and it's a closed circle, so we have to make sure that we do this, and that's our range. Again, this means that all the y values between -3 and 2 have a corresponding x value. Again, our domain is this, and our range is this. Let's go over here. We're introduced to a new type of thing. So again, we'll just start with domain. We read from left to right, and when we start going left, we see that this is our first value. This is at -1, -2, -3. So we write down -3. It's a closed circle, so we add a closed inequality sign. We'll continue reading from left to right, looking at only the x values. And we find our last one over here, which is at 1, 2, 3. We're talking about domain, so it's x. We have a closed circle, so it's that. And now we're at 1, 2, 3. This means that all the values between -3 and 3 of x have a corresponding y value that can be found on this graph here. Now let's talk about range. We know that range already is going to have a y, and I can see that we don't have any closed circles. Open circles. And I can see that we don't have any open circles. So I'm going to write these already. We read from bottom to top, and when we start at bottom, we hit here first, which is at -1, -2. We just continue reading, and this is our next point, but if you remember, we talk about solid lines. So our y ends up here, not down here, up here, because the graph continues all the way up here. 1, 2, 3. Our last value is 3. So our domain is this, and our range is this. This means that all the values of y between -2 and 3 have a corresponding x value on this graph. Lastly, we have this wonky kind of graph. Again, we read domain from left to right, and we're starting with domain. So let's start from left. We hit our first point here, which is at -1, -2, -3. It is an open circle, and open circle means this sign. We continue reading from left to right, where we hit here. This is at 1, 2, 3. It is an open circle, so we do that again. 1, 2, 3. This means that all values between -3 and 3, excluding -3 and 3, have a corresponding y value. Now let's go ahead and do y. Again, we start from bottom to top, we read bottom to top, and let's start from bottom. So we can see we first hit over here because it's a solid line, and that's at -1, -2, -3. It's a solid line, so it must have an equals to, and we continue reading up. We hit our last point up here, which is at 1, 2, 3. It is a solid line, so it must be solid, and we're at 3. Hopefully that makes a lot of sense. And thank you so much for sticking around. And just one heads up, the line of the graph that we are talking about does not have to be a function. We can have a line that looks, excuse my extremely bad graph, but we can have a line that looks like this. And it could still be we can still identify the domain and the range. All right, hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. But essentially, domain and range is talking about all the x values versus all the y values in a graph of a line. And this is called inequality notation. You learn about the other notation in Math 3. Again, thank you so much for sticking around, and I hope these videos are coming out helpful for you.